advising clients across the country. Here he is, your host, J. Christopher Boyd.
Welcome back to Something More with Chris Boyd, the show where we talk about not only those important dollar and cents issues, but also what makes the money matters matter. I'm here with Jeff Perry, and we both are advisors with Asset Management Resources. Our next guest, David Walker, is a former Comptroller General with the United States of America. Over the past 2 decades, David Walker has been, I guess I'm going to compare you, David, to a prophet in the wilderness, warning our nation of the impending problems of taking on too much debt. He has led the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, the Comeback America Initiative, been a candidate for governor in Connecticut, and he has served as a distinguished visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. He's also a speaker and author. David, welcome back to Something More with Chris Boyd, and thank you for being with us here.
Good to be with you, Chris. Yes, I've been fighting for fiscal responsibility and sustainability for 30 years with various hats on. And probably the name that has been associated with me the most is Paul Revere, which I'm all for because I lived in Virginia and I'm sons of the American Revolution, and Paul Revere was from Virginia.
And you're both.
That's funny. Yeah, that's awesome.
Actually, his famous ride was in Massachusetts, to correct the record.
That's true, yeah. Which is where we are.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. So we got that in common.
We have some clips that we won't get to play right this moment. Do we have them? Oh, great. All right. We have some clips. You were here with us in 2008, and I want to share those with you as we get started. Let me just play them for a moment.
And so we've gone from a situation where in 2000, where we had large and growing surpluses that were projected to continue for a number of years, to where we now have large and growing deficits. And for the first time, we may have a $1 trillion deficit in fiscal 2009.
And then, which is kind of funny now to hear, but let's keep going. There's one other that I'll share with you.
First, the latest number that I've heard as far as the current debt is about $10.7 trillion, which is, we're going to come close to doubling the debt of the United States within this last 8-year period. Yeah. Shocking. And in addition to that, we have dramatically increased our reliance on foreign lenders. Because unfortunately, Americans don't save to the extent that they should, and we have to therefore rely upon foreign lenders, which means we're mortgaging America. So that's not good.
Okay, I thought it might be fun just to share some of that. We had a long conversation a long time ago, and it's only gotten worse. So I thought you might find it entertaining to hear where those numbers were then when we had just started with a $1 trillion deficit, and we've had many, many since. Maybe you could share with us insight where we're at.
Let's update the numbers. You heard the numbers from 2008. 2008 was when I left as Comptroller General of the United States in order to become the first CEO of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. I think I said it was a little over 10 trillion in debt subject to the debt ceiling limit. It's now over 31 trillion.
Yeah.
Since we've had $1 trillion deficits on a recurring basis, projected to continue in the future. We're now in a situation where debt to GDP has doubled since I left. It's over 100%. And if you want to count the debt that we owe to the trust funds, it's over 125%, which is the highest it's ever been in the history of the country. If you want to look at the debt subject to the debt ceiling, it's tripled since I left office, and it's going to end up being raised again. In that regard, I'm cautiously optimistic. I participated on a phone call this morning, or Zoom call this morning with several bipartisan senators and members of the House, and I'm cautiously optimistic that they are going to reach a deal. And one of the things that may be an element of that deal is something I've been arguing for many years, and that is we need a statutory fiscal sustainability commission that learns the lessons from Simpson Bowles, that engages the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices for an extended period of time, a year or more, and that ultimately makes recommendations that deal with mandatory spending, discretionary spending, taxes, and budget reforms that will be guaranteed an up or down vote in Congress. That's the kind of approach you're going to have to take. But in addition to that, we're ultimately going to need a constitutional amendment. We should repeal the debt ceiling, which has been a bad joke and failed miserably. It turns out to be a political football more than anything else. And we should replace it with a constitutional amendment that limits how much debt as a percentage of the economy this country can take on, absent extraordinary circumstances. Other countries have embraced that, like Switzerland, Sweden, many European countries have embraced it. It's a pro-growth approach, but it forces Congress to make tough choices on spending and revenues so that they don't continue to mortgage the future of our country, our children and grandchildren, which is irresponsible, unethical, and immoral, and must stop.
You just went through a ton of things that I think we got to go through. We got to parse that a little bit. Let's go through those in more detail. That's all terrific. Simpson Bowles, you mentioned. Why did that fail? What happened? I mean, didn't we go through this whole thing with a commission and?
Well, let's do the old compliment and counsel approach, right? Which is what we're all taught, right? I mean, Simpson Bowles did very good work. And I would say that 85% plus of what they recommended was very good and valid. The problem is that, Simpson Bowles was 2010, this is 2023, and we're in much worse shape. So, and time's working against us. But there were several fundamental problems with Simpson Bowles. Number one, it was not statutory, which means it wasn't by law. And therefore, there was not a guaranteed buy-in up front by the Senate, the House, and the president. All right. Secondly, it was comprised.
And that's got to be hard for everyone to buy into something before they know what the outcome's going to be, right? And that's what you're talking about with statutory.
No, but that's what's necessary in order to make sure people have bought in and in order to guarantee a vote. So if you do a statutory commission. Part of the statute would say that their recommendation is going to be guaranteed vote if they meet a certain threshold. Now let's talk about the threshold. The threshold for Simpson Bowles was 75%. That's way too high. Now, it should be 60 to 67%. That's what it is to get something moved in the Senate or to override a veto. Thirdly, the composition of Simpson Bowles included sitting politicians. They have a fundamental conflict of interest. It included people that had affiliations with organizations that had a fundamental conflict of interest. What you need is capable, credible, and non-conflicted professionals to be on this. Thirdly, Simpson Bowles did nothing, absolutely nothing, to engage the American people in a meaningful way, to help build the case for the need for reforms, to listen to their input, before they ended up coming up with a package of recommendations. Now, they did try to engage the public some after they came up with their recommendations, and that's the way that Washington works. We got all the answers here. We're going to go out and sell you on it. No, the people are way ahead of the politicians. I know that because I've engaged the people in 47 states with citizen education engagement efforts. And so those are some of the differences between what Simpson Bowles did, the good work that they did, and what is needed in order to make sure that we get a mechanism that can result in positive outcomes. And by the way, part of that is a guaranteed up or down vote on their package of recommendations. So you engage the people, you set the table for a tough vote to give politicians cover. Because the idea that we're going to make these decisions in the regular order on a piecemeal basis is a pipe dream.
You hit into some of the realities that what's going to be needed, and higher taxes is among those. Spending reform, I heard you say as well. None of this is popular among politicians, to sell again, so the practical reality is, though, there's a limit to what we can do if we don't actually tighten the belt and bring in more revenue, right? When you spoke last time to us, a long time ago, but we talked about the fact that when it comes to the budget, there's only a limited amount of the budget that refers to discretionary spending. So we were talking earlier in the show that there's need for addressing some of the other, Social Security and Medicare and so forth. The runway on these, their viability is getting shorter for without having a shortfall. So do you envision this being something that's comprehensive as it addresses all aspects of the budget?
Everything has to be on the table.
Yeah.
No exceptions. Social insurance programs, taxes, defense, everything has to be on the table. The truth is, there's a new 4-letter word in federal fiscal policy. It's called math. The math,
arithmetic. Yeah.
It is a
math.
new word.
Well, that's too long a word. Okay. But
Math. Math.
But the fact,
Money in, money out. Yeah.
right. The fact is the numbers are clear and compelling. Our hole is so deep, you can't grow your way out. You can't just cut your way out. You can't just tax your way out. And so what's going to have to happen is we're going to need to reform social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, and secure, and to also recognize demographic and other realities. All right. Secondly, we're going to have to reprioritize and reduce projected spending for discretionary, which includes defense. And thirdly, we're going to have to engage in comprehensive tax reform that, among other things, will increase the amount of revenue we're getting as a percentage of GDP. We're going to have to do all three of those things in order to come up with something that can achieve sustainable success and that is politically feasible. Because there are some things that Democrats aren't going to like, and there's some things that Republicans aren't going to like. But in the end, compromise is not a bad word. And in fact, it was one of the critical words that was used in practice in order to achieve the greatest political document in the history of mankind. It's called the U.S. Constitution.
You mentioned a constitutional amendment. You just used the word compromise. We seem to have an era. I don't know how unique it is, but there's a lot of dysfunction. We can't seem to agree on, the color of the sky these days, So how do you actually get something constructive as what you're just describing, something that comprehensive, and even to ratify it with a constitutional amendment you mentioned to change the way the debt ceiling works and some of these limitations on how much we spend? Can we? Is that even possible?
Well, there's two tracks. Okay, track one, which hopefully could be part of a debt ceiling agreement, is the creation of a statutory fiscal sustainability commission along the lines of what we've talked about. Track two is to achieve a constitutional amendment that will limit how much debt the country can take on as a percentage of the economy, and hopefully set a target to reduce the level of debt to GDP over a period of time through a number of reforms. And those reforms could come out of this statutory commission. What we know is the debt ceiling has not constrained the growth of government, has not constrained spending, has not constrained deficits and debt. All right. And so we need to have something else. Now, there's two ways to get a constitutional amendment. The old-fashioned way, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate pass something. They send it to the states, 3/4 ratify it. That's how we've gotten all 27 so far. But the founders were very smart people. And they were very visionary, and they realized that Congress might become so out of touch and out of control, or so polarized, or have certain items where they had a conflict of interest, like constraining spending, like term limits, like campaign finance, that the states should have the right to exercise their rights under the Constitution. And that if 2/3 of the states, that's 34 states, called for a convention of states to propose one or more amendments to the Constitution, that the Congress shall set the date and place for that. Guess what? Work by myself and a few others found out that we had 39 states with active applications in 1979, 40 active applications in 1983, and Congress never did anything. They never did anything because they never assigned responsibility for somebody to receive, maintain and count these applications. And so now there's two efforts that I'm involved with, one of which is in the House Continuing Resolution 24. Chairman of the Budget Committee, Jody Arrington, has introduced it. to bring light to this. With light comes heat, and hopefully heat will come action. And the second track is working with one or several states' attorneys general who, if the Congress fails to act within a reasonable period of time, would file suit that would ultimately get decided by the Supreme Court to force the Congress to act. So we need both of these things. They're related, but they're on different time tracks, and there are different mechanisms that are necessary in order to achieve them.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'd never heard of that as another approach to this.
And let me give you a website. Let us vote for FRA.org. Let us vote for the word for FRA.org. You can find out more about it.
All right. I'm jotting that down. All right. Thanks. We'll include that in our show notes when we have the podcast. I guess I find it so challenging because, we're in this period where everyone is in their own encampment of their version of reality, their perceptions of truth. And to tackle something, to get that kind of consensus, even for a constitutional amendment, seems such an uphill climb.
Well, let me come back on that for a second, Chris, because I just engaged in a conversation this morning. You're talking about the word truth.
Yeah.
What we need is facts.
Yes.
People need to be given the facts, and then they will determine what they deem to be true. What they don't need is a bunch of partisan, ideological, conflicted politicians to assert what the truth is and to not give them the facts so that people can use their own brains to make up their own minds. And let me tell you why I'm encouraged. The reason I'm encouraged is in 2012, which is after the last time we met, I did a 10,000-mile, 27-state national fiscal responsibility bus tour. Was funded largely by the late H. Ross Perot Sr.
Oh, yeah.
And in that, we achieved over 90% agreement on a fiscal goal on debt to GDP, over 90% from representative groups of citizens who spent over a half a day with us, getting the facts, learning the truth, and over 90% agreement on a split between spending versus revenues, over 90% agreement on 6 principles and values that bring people together rather than dividing them apart, and that would be the basis for determining reforms, and 77 to 97% agreement on budget controls, Social Security reforms, healthcare reforms, Medicare, Medicaid, tax reforms, defense reforms, government organization operational reforms, and political reforms. 77 to 97%. So that's where I come back to where I started. You have to start with the people. You have to tell them where we've been, where we are, where we're headed, what the consequences are of doing nothing, the benefits of acting sooner or later. And then you need to, solicit from them their thoughts, recognizing that it's going to have to be a package of recommendations. You're going to like some of it, you're not going to like other. But let's put it this way, the way we're going, America won't be a superpower in 2040 if we don't change course. And that's my latest book, America in 2040, still a superpower, question mark.
Question mark. I thought that's what you might say.
Right. And the answer is yes, if, and no, unless. And this is part of the way forward.
So, sir, how far away today are we to those measurements, those economic measurements, debt to GDP, et cetera, that you just referenced? How far away from those goals or those guidelines?
Let's talk about that, Jeff. That's, back in 2000 and back in 2012, we set the ultimate goal to try to get to 60% of debt to GDP by 2035. All right. Well, we're over 100 now when you count what we owe.
Or double, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think a realistic goal is to cap total debt to GDP at 125, and we've got room before we're there, okay, with limited exceptions, and to set a goal of 90% of debt to GDP to try to get to that number by around 2035, all right? And this commission is a way to help us get there, right? Mm-hmm. But what you keep in mind this, statutory limits, whether it's the debt ceiling, whether it's Graham-Rudman, where it's spending caps, where it's pay-go rules, they have never stood the test of time because one Congress can't bind another Congress under our Constitution. So the only thing that can bind current and future Congresses is a constitutional amendment. And 49 states have them for the state finances.
Right.
Although a lot of them are fundamentally flawed. Okay. And the balanced budget approach is what they normally talk about at the state level, but they try to balance cash flows rather than accrual basis. Balanced budget won't work at the federal level, but debt to GDP will, and other countries have taken it, and that's what we need to do.
Maybe elaborate on how that is different. And let me ask you, are there times when, this could be constraining in a way that might be problematic, or what are the risks associated with that? You can see how we have a problem. The debt keeps growing, we're, as you pointed out, exceeding 100% of GDP at this point. And that becomes problematic over time. The costs are going to be now increasingly costly. But are there windows? Are there moments of time where we say this becomes an urgent matter? We should give ourselves some flexibility.
Wartime, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there need to be exceptions, but those exceptions need to be narrow. Okay.
And codified in the rules.
And delineated, right? Yeah.
Basically, and let me give you an illustrative example. Okay. An illustrative example is you cap debt held by the public to GDP at 120 to 125%. Reasonable people can differ. All right. Now we're a little over 100. All right. But you cap it at that. No. The second thing is that you set a goal to try to get down to 90, and we're over that now and headed up fast. Within a 10 to 15 year period of time. Okay. In addition to that, for both, there would be narrow exceptions. A formal declaration of war, not an authorization to use force, a formal declaration of war, which by definition requires 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. All right. A unexpected national emergency or a significant economic downturn that is declared with a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate, and is only good for 1 year. So if you want to extend it beyond that, you have to re-up it, if you will.
Gotcha. Yep.
So the key words there: unexpected. All right, so yes, there need to be some exceptions, but those exceptions need to be narrow.
Yeah. All right. What is the consequence if you exceed these parameters?
Oh, I'll give you one potential consequence. Keep in mind that every member of Congress swears an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Okay. And this would be a constitutional amendment. So by definition, if you willingly violated this, you have not kept your oath of office, and therefore you lose your right to run for re-election. Wow. Now, there could be others, but you got to have something that gets people's attention.
Absolutely.
GDP is something that fluctuates, right? It moves up and down. Does this give us some room for that kind of fluctuation from, periods of recessions and things of that sort?
It does, but, understand this. By going debt to GDP, it is pro-growth, because if you grow the denominator faster than the numerator, even if the numerator is going up, you're making progress. And by the way, after World War II, that's what we did. We didn't pay down debt. We grew the denominator faster than now. The problem is, though, government's much bigger, much more of the budget is mandatory spending. Demographics are working against us. Healthcare costs are a problem. And by the way, as you both know, the fastest growing expense in the federal government is interest. And what do you get for interest? Nothing. Okay.
Right.
If you look at gross interest, what we're paying, not just for debt held by the public, but also the bonds held in the trust funds, we're already spending more in interest than we are in defense. And within 5 years, just on the net interest, we're going to be spending more in interest than we are on defense. And that's outrageous. Okay. And going up. So yes, there need to be safety valves. Okay. But pro-growth, and it doesn't tell the Congress how to solve the numerator problem. It doesn't say how much of it is mandatory spending, how much of it is discretionary spending. How much of it is revenues? You know, so they have to decide it. But if they don't do it, then things happen. Like, for example, suspending indexing, indexing of tax rates or cost of living increases or whatever else. Okay. You know, an across the board reduction, a surcharge, you know, on taxes that people see in their line item. We failed to do our job, and now you're going to pay a price. That gets people's attention. On the other hand, if you're ahead of schedule, you could see a dividend declared that would be on your tax return. So these are illustrative examples. In the final analysis, it would be decided by the Convention of States. They would have to decide what they want to do, and it would have to be operationalized by statute. But it would have to be specific enough that they couldn't undercut it, you know, in statutory language.
You know, I think we've kind of elaborated on the problem to some extent. You know, now we've been talking about, you know, resolution of how do we address it, but I want to come back to the problem. And this is one of the questions we get asked very frequently is, you know, how much can the country borrow? When does it become unsustainable?
What's
you know,
the
this
tipping
kind of
point,
thing.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. What's the tipping point?
First, only God knows.
It's something that's in flux, right? It's different. But do you have any thoughts around that issue?
First, only God knows, you know, what that is, and God's not telling us. Okay. So, but what we do know is that when you get debt to GDP over about 90%, it retards economic growth. The less economic growth, the less opportunity. All right. In addition to that, what we do know is we're unduly reliant upon others to finance our deficits. That's not in our national security or foreign policy interest. What we do know is that some of the people who have purchased our debt in the past, their appetite is waning. In particular, China, their appetite.
Right.
What we do know is that there's a number of countries around the world that are looking at alternatives to the dollar, and that we're going to lose market share with regard to the world's global reserve currency, which probably means higher inflation over time, higher interest rates over time, and less advantages with regard to trade and the ability to impose sanctions. So, you know, there are very real consequences, right? Now, most of these things end up happening gradually over time, and they accumulate over time, but they've already started. Okay. And, you know, for example, let's look at interest rates. I mean, you know, the excessive federal spending and the loose money policy by the Fed for too long resulted in excess inflation. That combined with doing a 180 on energy policy. We were energy independent on January 20th, 2001, and there was a 180 done on energy policy. And what people don't understand is energy is not just about gasoline and natural gas. It's also about fertilizer. It's about transporting goods across the country, right? So the bottom line is there are very real consequences, and we're already starting to feel them. The whole point is when you know you're on an imprudent and unsustainable path, when you know the power of compounding is working against you,
yes,
you should act sooner rather than later, because failure to act will have disastrous economic, national security, foreign policy, and domestic tranquility consequences.
David Walker, I know we're short on time, and appreciate. Jeff, did you want to throw in one question there?
I just want to say this conversation needs more time. And David, you mentioned a new book coming out. Could you just give us a couple of seconds on that?
Yeah, it's already out, and
Okay.
I self-published it. So I'm not doing it to make money. Okay, my last book, Come Back America, was a national bestseller, and I didn't make money on that either. I gave all the proceeds to the not-for-profit. But it's called America in 2040: Still a Superpower ? And it's about economic security and national security, and it includes a lot of the results of the 10 million a minute tour that I did in 2012, which should give hope to people that there is a way forward.
Well, we need hope for sure. Can people find that on Amazon or?
Yeah, they can get it on Amazon. It's online. It's just in time printing. So, Amazon's the quickest way. Author House is the publisher. You can get it on their website too. You probably can get it on Barnes and Noble's website, but you have to order it online because it's just in time printing. That's the way of the world.
That's the way it is now. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
David Walker, thank you for your continued outspoken voice on this problem and trying to help give us solutions to address it. I appreciate that you consistently have made this a priority, and I think it's a contribution to our country that you're doing this. So thank you. Remember, listeners, check out that book, America 2040, Still a Superpower. Or you can go to Let Us Vote. What was it? Let Us
Vote for
FRA.org and check that out as well. Anything else for following you, David, that you want to promote for people to?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I've got a small presence on Twitter. I came off of Twitter because I got upset with them, but I am on Twitter now, so people can look me up. But I appreciate it, guys. I'm fighting for our country, for our children, and for our grandchildren.
Thank you, sir, for your service to our country.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us as well.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You're listening to Something More with Chris Boyd, Financial Talk Show.
Asset Management Resources, LLC, and J. Christopher Boyd, CFP, provide investment advice on an individual basis to clients only. Proper advice depends on a complete analysis of all facts and circumstances. The information given on this program is in the nature of general financial comments and cannot be relied upon as pertaining to your specific situation. AMR, LLC cannot guarantee that using the information from this show will generate profits or ensure freedom from loss. Listeners should consult their own financial advisors or conduct their own due diligence before making any financial decisions.